Hello, everyone, and welcome back for the conclusion of Understanding Religious Art with Jack Kowiak. Thank you for coming. Jack?
Thank you very much, Stacy. Well, welcome to our final class in Understanding Religious Art. This is the fourth and last class that we're going to have, and I think you'll find some interesting topics here that I'm going to close out the session with. Now, just as a review for anybody that's joining us for the first time, this won't be a typical kind of a art history or art class where you're talking about different elements of a painting or artwork, looking at the shape and the color and pesto techniques or whatever the history of the particular artist was that did the painting. We're not going to cover any of that type of thing. This class is really concentrating on something else that's called iconography, which is the meaning in images and symbols that are used in the artwork. So I thought I would kick off the session today with a little something that's actually kind of been in the news that relates to religious art and iconography. It was an article in the New York Times. And in the article, it talks about the Italians agree that this ancient fresco is a masterpiece, but all else is open to debate. Well, it happens there's this little fresco that's sitting. It's called the Madonna Frescoes. And it was painted in the 1450s. And it exists in a sleepy little village over in Tuscany called Monasci. Very little small village up there in northern Italy, barely has 2,000 people on it. And they have this particular fresco in an old church that's sitting there. And what you're seeing in front of you is a cemetery. They didn't have room for a cemetery, so the city went to the Vatican and asked if they could get enough property for this cemetery, so that the Vatican ceded them some of the property around the church to build this cemetery. But it's got an interesting background with this area because the church was built on the site of an ancient spring. And the spring was seen to be a fertility spring, that people would come for miles and miles along to drink from the spring, either to be cured from some illness or if some woman was expecting a baby, that they would have a healthy baby. So this iconography kind of built up that someone wanted to do a painting around this. And a fellow who was raised in the village, a particular artist, did this painting. And it's a Madonna painting. And if you look at it, it covers some of the things we spoke about before in these classes. She's got a halo that looks like a hat, which was a fad for halos for a while. And they got the drape in back of her. I explained that before, that was something they used to, that was a carryover from the Roman emperors, that when they used to speak, they would hang a drape in back of them so no one could stand in back of them and make faces and stuff. And she's dressed in the traditional blue of Mary to symbolize heaven. And in this one, she's shown expecting, which, we have seen Madonna pictures where she was expecting. And so the particular artist tied this iconography into it, that this was kind of tied into this wellspring of life in terms of this fountain in this picture of Mary. And we've seen that in Annunciation paintings that we've discussed before, that one of the codes in Annunciation paintings is you'll see a water vase or a well to be this kind of wellspring of life. And this painting was done by this fellow. And he was actually mostly a mathematician. And he just kind of got into painting as a sidelight to exercise his skills in geometry to do perspective. And he wasn't that big of an artist in his day. He never left a big following or anything, but this was one of the paintings that he left behind. And he figured he'd build in this iconography tied into this spring, this wellspring, with her being expecting on this wellspring of life. Well, lo and behold, in the 20th century, this guy gets rediscovered as a great hidden artist. Oh, we discounted his paintings before, but on second look, he's really a brilliant artist. And he became like a really hot thing in Renaissance art. Well, the Vatican heard about this. And they said, this painting's and fresco's in pretty tough shape. We'll finance some restoration work for it. So they couldn't do it in the church. There was no room there. So they asked for the permission of the town, and they moved it to this old dilapidated school building. And they used that as the studio to move this giant fresco, this big piece of the wall, and start doing restoration on the fresco. And with the restoration, they were able to bring out a lot of brilliant colors. Well, meanwhile, while this restoration was going on, the town fathers got together, you know, at the city council, and they said, we've got nothing going on in this town, let's take advantage of this. So they started publicizing this restoration and encouraging tourists to come in. And they set up a display for them where they could come in and look at this fresco and see the display. And in the other rooms in the school, they set up people selling stuff in terms of souvenirs. And it brought in huge, huge crowds into this tiny village. It was attracting like 30,000 visitors a year to this tiny village. And their whole economy during this restoration was built around this giant tourist trade. So all around this, they had different restaurants and shops and everything that got built out to accommodate these thousands of people that are pouring into this town suddenly to view this kind of undiscovered piece of great Renaissance art. So the restoration was done, and the Vatican comes back and says, well, we'd like to get this painting moved back into the church. And the church father said, not so fast. We got our whole economy based upon this thing. We can't move this to the church. It's kind of like on the outskirts. No one's going to be coming into town anymore for the restaurants and all the other stuff we need. And the Vatican says, well, you know, right across the street from this dilapidated school is kind of an old convent, which is quite nice. Why don't we move it into that convent? And the church father said, you move it into the convent, then you're going to take it back and we'll never see it again. And they said, well, okay. The Vatican says, let's do this. Why don't we set up some things where you could send that on tour to these big museums like the Louvre and the University of Chicago. And if you do that, they'll pay you a lot of money. And then you could use that money to build a halfway decent place to display it as opposed to this junky school. I mean, we can't have this great piece of art now displayed in this junky school. And they still didn't trust the Vatican. They said, no, as soon as it gets outside our walls here, you're going to figure out some legal way to seize it. And the Vatican was trying to get it because they said, well, they own the rights to the painting because it was in their church. And then the town hired a bunch of lawyers to come back and say, well, once you ceded the land for the cemetery, you also ceded the land for the church to the town. So the town officially owns the church, which means they own that fresco. And they're battling this back in court. So finally, they reached this compromise. And the Vatican funded a nice looking museum to put this thing. And they did a bunch of compromises where they kind of located the museum kind of a little bit outside the city walls, but it was still on a main avenue that all the tourists that flowed in to this place could still go into the city and keep up their kind of tourist trade and all of that. But the iconography of the painting kind of changed. Rather than being the Madonna of this wellspring, to safeguard themselves, the town kind of rechristened the Madonna with a new name. It's now the Madonna of Monticello. So the town could officially have claim to this and no one can take it away. So we can see that iconography can be kind of a moving target here, depending upon politics. Well, I thought I'd spend some time today speaking about Buddhist religious art. And if you look at Buddhist religious art, one of the things that kind of strikes you right away when you look at different statues and different types of paintings is this thing about kind of hand gestures. You know, when we think of hand gestures, we think of more stuff like well, the Buddhists have their own idea of hand jive, right? Their paintings very much have these different types of hand motions. You can see here doing something with the hands. Look at this other painting, doing something else with the hands. Over here, you can see they even bring the feet in with the hands to do some type of gesture. So what's going on with this type of Buddhist hand jive they put into all of their paintings? Well, the official name for that, now it looks like it's pronounced mudra, but it's not. It's actually pronounced medra, actually. And it is a Sanskrit word that means a sign or a token. And it is a very predominant thing in Buddhist art, but it exists in many other areas as well. You'll see this very much as well in different types of Hindu art, where they're doing gestures with their hand. As a matter of fact, all throughout Southeast Asia, you'll see mudras used in various paintings and statues and stuff. So let's investigate, and they're used in a lot of different ways. I mean, you see them used in art, but these mudras are also used as a part of prayer in many Buddhist monk denominations. You've seen them used for meditation. If you've been to a yoga class or seen someone meditated, they're doing something with their hands to try to focus their meditation. And if you've ever watched some Hindu dancers, a key element of Hindu dance is making various hand and arm gestures. And these are all mudras. So why don't we take a look and see what the iconography of these is and what exactly does this particular type of hand jive mean? Well, let's look at some very prominent ones and popular ones to begin with. Let's look at something called the 5 Buddha mudras, and these are the ones you'll generally see on a statue of Buddha. Now, the first one, to kind of understand what it is, it's kind of similar to this idea that, hey, you want to catch something. So what do you do when you catch something? You put your hands up, you're going to catch it, right? Well, that's what the first one I'm going to show you is. It's called the Vyaha mudra. And the idea is that Buddha will catch you if you fall, if your soul falls, if you come into danger, right? So you're come to me for protection. That's what this particular mudra comes. Come to me, I will catch you. No matter what the problem is, what you've done wrong, who's threatening you, I will catch you and help you and save you. Another one that you'll see signifies Buddha as a teacher. And to signify Buddha as a teacher, you'll see them make this particular mudra. And the way this one works is that you make a circle with your one hand here, and then you take your other finger, either your ring finger or your middle finger, and you turn this circle as though you're turning a wheel, all right? And that's the teaching Buddha. And the reason that that's the teaching Buddha is what you're doing is you're turning with your finger the wheel of law, something that's referred to as dharma. Dharma can mean a lot of, it's an ancient word that means a lot of different things depending upon the context it's used and the region that it's used. But in this case, it kind of means the way that things should be done, the right path, kind of the rules of things that have to be followed. And those rules are often symbolized in this wheel, the wheel of law. And there's different explanations for what the wheel of law is. One common one is look at the wheel and say, well, this is how you're supposed to go through life, okay? You have the hub of the wheel, the tire, and that's where the rubber hits the road, right? And that's all of your experiences. You're going through all the potholes and bumps and smooth roads and different things. And you should learn from those experiences as part of how you should run your life. When something happens, you learn from those types of things. But as you're experiencing those things, you have to remember the spokes. And the spokes are all equal. And that's teaching you to treat all people equally. You don't discriminate against people, or if you're in a bad mood, you don't treat people grouchy one day, and if you're in a good mood, you treat them nice the other day. You treat people equally throughout life. And then the other thing to remember is this hub, which is the truth. So that's a foundation for how you lead your life with the truth, but that's tempered by always by the axle. And the axle represents modesty and compassion. Modesty that, well, you may think you know the truth, but maybe you don't quite know the truth. And maybe there's more than one truth that exists. So you have to be modest in your assessment of the truth and use the truth in a compassionate manner. Don't use the truth to harm someone. You know, if you're eating someone, if you're invited to dinner and you don't like the food, you don't say, blah. You smile and say, what a great cook you are, okay? So this is kind of symbolizing one expression of the wheel of the Dharma, ways you should kind of go through life. And that's why it's a symbol of the teaching, Buddha. Let's look at another mudra. Now, which baby do you think is crying? And which baby do you think is sleeping and happy or relaxed? Well, probably the one on the left with the closed fist is crying, right? Because you think of this idea that your clenched fist is very tensed, and then once you relax, okay, you're very relaxed when it's opened. And that's why this is the mudra for the meditating Buddha, where you're supposed to be totally relaxed and concentrated. There's a very famous story that as the Buddha was meditating and approaching nirvana, he was tempted by the demon Mara, who tempted him with all types of things, with powerful armies that he could have, beautiful women and riches and all types of stuff. And then what the Buddha did at that point is he touched the ground to have testament to the earth of his thing, that it called up the earth goddess, Shafara. And then she came up, and then with the waters that she brought forth, she drowned all the demons that were tempting the Buddha. So that's why you'll also see this other famous mudra on the Buddhist paintings where he's touching the ground. He's touching the ground to call witness and bring up the earth goddess. Let's ward away temptation. So this mudra is also used a lot with the idea of dispelling temptation that you're with. Now, many people are familiar with this particular mudra. You see this all the time when people go to a yoga class, right? They do this kind of thing, right? And they say namaste, which is actually doesn't mean any kind of mystical thing. It just means howdy, how you doing in Hindi. And it's taken on a big metaphysical meaning among yoga people, but that's another story. What this mudra is, it's a long time ago when they would leave offerings at a Hindu temple. You would put an offering perhaps between the two hands, and then you would bow down and offer it out to the deity. And then over time, this evolved as kind of a general greeting or a sign of respect to people to do this. You just kind of bow. You don't do the kind of opening of the hands anymore like they used to at a temple to give their offering. But to be honest, when you see this type of mudra offered in a Buddha, and you could see these for sale calling the Buddha Namaste, that's not a real Buddha statue. Because in traditional Buddhism, that particular mudra is never used with the Buddha because the Buddha has nothing to offer or give thanks for because he's already achieved nirvana. So you never see this in true Buddhism. This is really something that's a Western invention that they use for statues or something you see in a restaurant someplace. It's not a true Buddha statue. It's not a true Buddha mudra. Now, these could get pretty complicated. Because each of your 5 fingers could represent different elements. Water, earth, space, air, fire. Different combinations of them can mean all different types of things in these hand gestures. So actually, if you look at all the mudras there are, it's like a lot. I mean, there's over 100 different types of mudras that are used for all different types of very complex and esoteric type belief systems. And I just showed you a very small subsample of them over here. Well, let's look at another element of Buddhist art. You can remember back in the 60s, there were people like Peter Max, and he would do these kind of psychedelic paintings, right? Well, the Buddhists were way ahead of Peter Max. Centuries and centuries ahead of him, 1,000 years ahead of them, they were generating their own kind of psychedelic paintings. And they were called Thanga. They were generally done on silk or some type of a textile, and they were pretty wild affairs. You could see this big demon here, and he's chewing on the wheel of law, and all of this stuff is going on. Now, these were, we talked about mandalas that were generally used as meditation devices. The Thanga paintings were more used as teaching tools. And they would have some type of religious figure in the center with different elements of their life. And they would use this as a teaching tool where they go around and talk about the history of this person and what they did during their lives. And one of the most popular thankas that are done are what are called red thankas. And they are looking at different elements in the life of the Buddha. Now here's the Buddha here in the center, and it's showing different elements. Like here, he's getting nirvana under the Bodhi tree, where he first meditated. And there's the death of the Buddha, the reclining Buddha, where he finally leaves the world. And this particular one is from Tibet. So they were actually showing over here the string of different Dalai Lama that have taken place since. So a Tibetan monk would sit down there in front of this in a classroom, and a teacher would go through all of these scenes. Oh, here's the scene of the Buddha's birth, for example, they would be taught, where the elephant would pierce, the elephant's tusk would pierce the Buddha's mother to impregnate her with the Buddha. And the teacher would go through all of these scenes and use these to tell stories about the Buddha's life and what the teachings and meanings of all of this are. And they can cover a lot of characters, not just the Buddha. For example, many people are unaware that in many areas of Buddhism, there's female Buddha deities. They're usually referred to the white Tara. And these female Buddha deities are especially revered for compassion. Or you could have ones that are just the polar opposite, much more fierce deities that are used for protection, like Yama, the protector of Buddhism. And you can see this fierce-looking fellow trampling people under his feet, probably very much modeled around Kali, who was a very famous Hindu goddess of protection as well. And you can see it's very similar. Here's another one that I'm going to show you. And this is one of the Dalai Lama. And this one is to illustrate this particular Dalai Lama and some different things in this Dalai Lama's life that he accomplished and different types of spiritual messages he was trying to give. So thangas are very, very popular. They're actually, very rarely are they large things. Mostly they're quite small little types of paintings that are done in miniature. You can see a Japanese one here. And you can see they incorporated Japanese elements like carnations and more of the water element, because Japan is an island sitting on water, so they're all sitting in water. A Chinese one has more of the subtle colors of Chinese art. And besides the water, they have the mountains, because many of their gods exist in the mountains. And you can see these all over the place. And actually, they're quite valuable from a collector's standpoint. The other thing that you'll see in these thangas is, in addition to the scenes or around the scenes, you'll see quite a bit of decorative art. Like if you look up in this current order that's circled here. And that's very interesting, because if you look at Buddhist decorative art, it is quite involved. Here's traditional Buddhist decorative art. Now, we have spoken about decorative art in another class, and we talked quite a bit about Islamic decorative art that we call Arabesque, and they call it Islami, excuse me. Their decorative art is different than the Buddhist decorative art in that when we looked at the Islamic decorative art, it was based off of very complex geometry, which represented God's design of the world, and plants, which are God's gift, because they were living in the deserts and plants were a really valuable thing. And they made these complex plant designs based upon geometry. Buddhist decorative art instead is designed around what's called the 8 auspicious symbols. And what are these 8 symbols? Well, one of them is something we ran across once before, and that's the endless knot of eternity. This is a very, very ancient symbol, predates Buddhism. Sometimes it's referred to as a Solomon's knot. It was used by many, many, many ancient cultures. And it was used to represent immortality or infinity. And it was picked up, of course, because someone mentions in another class, the Celtic knot. That's also an interpretation of that. And one of the things we saw before when we were looking at Islamic calligraphy, that there was a style of calligraphy, Islamic calligraphy, that was based upon this idea of this knot of eternity. Well, some of these other symbols are the lotus blossom, and that's a symbol within Buddhism as well as in Shintoism. Actually, it goes back to other religions as well. It was very popular in Southeast Asia to represent some type of resurrection or reincarnation, because you have some kind of muddy water there, and then out of this muddy water comes this beautiful, pristine, beautiful flower that comes forth. So that's this idea of this coming to life, or reincarnation or nirvana. This other symbol here, believe it or not, that's kind of a warrior flag. They would carry this into, and it kind of looks like kind of a sissy flag for a warrior, but I imagine they would toughen it up and put a human head on top or something like that. So this was the idea of Buddha's victory over the endless cycle of rebirth that he was gaining nirvana. And of course, we spoke about the wheel of law, the Dharma. And this is a vase of sacred water. What you'll see here generally is it contains the three jewels of Buddhism. I seek refuge in the Buddha, I seek refuge in the Dharma, I seek refuge in the Sangha. The Sangha was their monasteries. So those are the kind of three fundamental jewels of Buddhism. And then these two fishes, which is an ancient symbol going back into India. It goes back to the fact that India is kind of bordered by two sacred rivers, the Indus on one side and the Ganges on the other side. And they're kind of containing so the fish represent that. And also the fish to the Buddhism represent release or freedom from the cycle of rebirth, because fish are seen as like super free things, right? They could be in a little stream and go to a big river and go to an ocean and go around the world and come back to the little stream again. They're totally free to go. The parasol was a sign of kingship or rank. Like if you look at an ancient painting, you can tell how important the king was, depending upon how many parasols and how fancy they were in his retinue. So the kingship of kind of the Buddha with the parasols. And the conch shell was a traditional thing that was used to call out a deity. So calling out to the deity, calling out to the Buddha, da 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 da, you blow on the conch shell. The Buddha has arrived to help us. So these are simple drawings of them, but when you see them in decorative art, they're quite fancy. They're so fancy, in fact, sometimes they're very difficult to recognize the way they're done. Like, for example, over here, here's the fishes, right? And here's the vase, here's the banner of victory, and here's the parasol, right? So they could be the lotus, they could be very much disguised. And to make it even more challenging, they tend to put these into a format where it's almost kind of like one of those, where's Waldo puzzles, where you got to find Waldo hidden someplace in here. That tends to be how they use these types of designs. For example, let's look at a very typical one. Can you spot all of the auspicious symbols? Well, we'll work our way up from the bottom. There's the lotus flower. There's our conch shell. There's our banner of victory. There's our Dharma, the wheel of law, and there's our fishes, right? There's our parasol that's up there. Now, where's our endless knot? I haven't been able to find that in here anyplace. Maybe this is supposed to represent it here. Let's look at another one. Yeah, looks like there's a fellow here, but it's actually, this face here is actually two fish heads, right? Here's the eye of the one fish, the eye of the others, and these are things coming down from the fish. And here are fish here around the Dharma, and here's our endless knot, infinity. with their lotus flower. Parasols up here someplace. Here's one that's kind of done in a tapestry. This one's a little easier to see. Their vase and our flower, endless knot, Dharma, the fish, the parasol. It's almost like a thankful one with the break. Our endless knot, the conch shell, our parasol, our fish, our vase, our Dharma, our lotus flower here on the bottom. Sometimes they make it a little easier for you. They'll give you a little key. So here's an example of this big tapestry that was done. So they gave you actually a little key that you could use this thing to go in and find out where the various ones were. And of course, they could be on anything, not necessarily tapestries or paintings. Here's an example, and these are very, very popular for tattoo art over in Asia. And you'll see many people that will include these symbols on tattoo art in Asia. Here's the knot and the fish and the lotus flower. Okay. Now, that's in Asia. In this country, we're more likely to see tattoo art, religious tattoo art, that looks like this, which would be a good introduction, perhaps, to talk a little bit about crucifixion art. Now, we think of this as some type of a mainstay of Christian art, but the truth is that if you look at very early Christian art, it was very rare, it's almost impossible to find a cross within the first 300-400 years of Christianity in artwork. The early Christians were called by the Romans cross worshippers as a derogatory term. And one of the expressions that they used to use was this Latin expression, il quote unquote meritur, which means they worship that which they deserve. In other words, they deserve to be crucified up on the crosses that they worship. So when we were talking about early Christian art a couple of classes ago, we talked about how much they hid their artwork. So they didn't want to make themselves target from lines. And so one of the worst things you could do to advertise yourself as a Christian and get thrown to the lines was start putting crosses all over the place. So you rarely ever saw a cross. Instead, what they would use were anchor symbols. And anchors were seen as a symbol of safety in a lot of religions because it's kind of a navigational aid that keeps you safe. You throw out the anchor and you don't drift into the rocks or something like that. So it was easy for them to borrow that. And also you could kind of get away with a bit of a cross symbolism in there. So they would use the fish, and we talked about this before, that if you look at the word fish in Greek, its initials spell out Jesus Christ, our Savior. If you take the first letters in Koine Greek, so they would marry the fish representing Jesus Christ with the anchor, with the idea of this kind of being a crucifix, a very early form of it. And they turn the anchor upside down or right side up sometimes to try to get the right effect. And if they did use crosses, they would use something where they couldn't be harmed. So they would put it on something like a sarcophagus, where the guy was dead already and you couldn't do anything to him. But once Constantine came in and made Christianity one of the official accepted religions within the Roman Empire, people started to use crosses. Starting in the 4th century, and by the 5th century, crosses started to become somewhat commonplace, but you really didn't see crucifixes. What they would use instead would be the Angus Day symbol that we spoke about before, with the lamb representing the sacrifice Jesus, and they might pair it up with a cross. That would be the closest they would get. Or the other thing they would use to represent a crucifix as opposed to a cross is they would use a jeweled cross with the jewels to represent Christ. Well, this changed, and they started coming out with crucifixes around the 6th century. This is one of the earliest ones we've ever seen. You can barely see it. It's very faint here. You see Christ on a cross here. And the reason they started using these crucifixion scenes goes back to something actually we spoke about before. And that was that Arian controversy. We were talking before in another class about where did this Alpha and Omega came up. And it had to do with this big fight where the people who were into the Arian camp felt that Christ had a dual nature, human and divine, and a whole bunch of other church people felt that Christ is simply divine and therefore invulnerable. So this group that was controlling a lot of the artwork in Rome, and where these people were in Alexandria, they were insisted on putting the Alpha Omega all over their artwork to emphasize their position. But the other way they emphasized their position was to have this idea of crucifixion scenes. And with their crucifixion scenes, and this is how crucifixion scenes were for the first 600 years that they made them, from about 600 to the 12th century, the crucifixion scenes look like this. It was called Christ triumphant. Christ is shown with his head up and his eyes wide open, with this idea that he is one divine nature. He's not suffering on the cross. He's invulnerable. He cannot be harmed. And you can see that in this other crucifixion scene as well. Here he is, eyes wide open, right? Can't be harmed, right? He's invulnerable. He's just of the divine nature. They got a picture of Judas hanging himself in this one as well. We don't think of that as a crucifixion. I mean, it looks odd to us now. What seems like a crucifixion scene to us today is something that happened from the 12th century onward. And that's this idea of the suffering Christ. And you'll see Christ very often with his eyes closed and his head tilted off to the side. Okay, very different. And that happened, one of the things that started that was the split between the Western and the Eastern churches, all right? I'll talk about this a little bit later when I talk about icons, but the Western church wanted to emphasize more Christ's forgiveness of original sin and the suffering Christ forgiving this sin. And for the suffering Christ, and they had other concepts of the incarnate Christ and things of mysticism, but they wanted to represent this more idea of the suffering Christ to emphasize their difference from the Eastern Orthodox. The other innovation that came in is, if you notice the other triumphant crucifixes I showed you, Christ's feet are just kind of apart, right? And we think of a crucifix now where the feet are together with a single nail. And this has nothing to do with iconography. Actually, this came about just as an artistic preference. The artists felt they can get a much more dramatic figure by doing this and kind of having this kind of more of a bent shape as opposed to kind of hanging down straight. And then this became an artistic follow. Now, we still don't see anything in the way of a crown of thorns on Christ that we typically see in a crucifixion scene. And the crown of thorns was introduced shortly after this. And that came about because of one man who was really not an artist. It was actually King Louis IX of France. He spent megabucks to purchase this relic that he brought in from the Middle East, which was supposed to be the actual crown of thorn on Christ's head. And he revered this as one of his most prized relics. He bragged, he publicized this all over the place that he brought this into France. And he decreed that all the different symbols of the crucifix from now on were to contain that crown of thorns. And he's the one that actually started introducing that to all of the artwork. Now, traditional rendering of a crucifixion will generally have Christ, maybe some angels, and then what's called the three Marys. Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, and then it's called Mary of James. And also a man who's generally John the Evangelist here. But they started expanding the number of people. So if a couple people were good, the idea was more people were going to be better. And they would throw in Roman soldiers and crowd people and different people into the painting and more angels in there. And then if more people were good, then if we get a real lot of people, that's even better. And then crucifixion got to be these extremely complex crowd scenes that they would do, with people not only at the site of the crucifixion, but in different buildings around, representing all different types of things. But this narrowed down to after the Renaissance, when they got into more contemporary paintings from maybe the 17th century on. Here's an example of one from the 19th century Gauguin, Crucifixion Art. Quite simple, right? Three Marys, perhaps John the Evangelist here in the background. No angels. But still, he's got the key elements of the head to the side of the eyes, close the single nail through there. Well, let's look at some other types of Christian artwork while we're on the subject of Christian art. You think it'd be great to be a saint. You know, hey, you go down in history as a saint. Who doesn't want to go on down in history as a saint? Well, there's a downside of being a saint, and that is how you are displayed in religious art. Now, you would think if you're a saint and you do great things, it'd be kind of like displayed heroically, like St. George, right? Slaying the dragon, doing something dramatic to help people out. It is rarely ever the case. Instead, as a saint, you're generally depicted in exactly the way that they were martyred, right? Here's some saint being martyred instead. So, for example, here's Saint Hippolytus. He's always pictured with a horse riding a horse. Now, Hippolytus never rode a horse in his life. He was always on foot, nothing to do with horses, but the way that he was martyred was he was drawn and quartered between 4 horses. So he's always pictured with a horse because that's the way that he met God. And this has become the code way of doing saints in terms of iconography. So we could give you a little quiz show here. And let's see if we can guess how all these different saints were martyred. Okay, let's look at good old Saint Ignatius of Antioch. How do you think this guy met his end? Here's a lion chewing on his shoulder, another one biting into his kneecap. Of course, he was eaten by lions. Here's Saint Sebastian. This isn't too hard to guess. He's holding up all the arrows. He became a pincushion, had all these arrows shot into him. How'd you like to be poor old St. Lawrence? And the way St. Lawrence met his end is they grilled him over this giant fire, right? That's how he died. So he goes through life in artwork carrying around his own personal barbecue to represent him throughout artwork in the way that this guy died. Poor old Saint Simon the Zealot. You can see right here, they gave him a nice big gold saw because he was sawed in half. This one is actually a little grislier than it would seem at first sight. Here's St. Bartholomew, and you think he was stabbed, but actually that's a very special knife that was used for skinning animals, and he was skinned alive, so they show him with this special knife that he was skinned alive. Or St. Clement, they tied an anchor to him and tossed him off a boat, and down he went into the deep sea, so he's always pictured there with this trusty anchor. So if you think it's great to be a saint, think again, because you got to think about how you're going to be portrayed for the rest of your life if you do meet a bad ending. Let's go from Western Christianity and talk a little bit about Eastern Christianity and talk about icons. And we have spoken a little bit about icons because we did talk a little bit about this particular one, this Virgin Adigitria. And I showed you a sample of one of the ones I got actually with my communion in an Eastern Ukrainian Orthodox church. And to understand icons, you have to understand about the differences between the Eastern and the Western churches in terms of theology. You know, if you look at the school textbooks, I mean, they're going to tell you, well, the reason the churches split was they were disagreeing over the power of the Pope. And actually, it was much, much deeper than that. There were major differences in theology between the two different churches. There were different missionaries that converted Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And the two missionaries that converted Eastern Europe were kind of away, and they were further away from Rome and were not under their thumb. And so they did more freelancing, and they brought in belief systems from Zoroastrians and even Hindu stuff and different things from Eastern religions. And so different concepts in how Christianity evolved. For example, I mentioned in Western Christianity, they wanted to emphasize this idea of Christ dying on the cross to forgive the sins of mankind, to forgive original sin. Eastern Christianity does not have that concept. There's no concept of original sin in Eastern Christianity. So they do not see Christ dying on the cross to forgive man's sins. They have even a different eschatology, which is kind of the end of the world. So in Western Christianity, you have this end of the world where some people would say it's going to be this, the four horses of the apocalypse come, the world goes to pot, and then the Savior comes in on the second coming, and he kind of saves the world. Well, that doesn't happen in Eastern Christianity. In Eastern Christianity, what happens is the life of Christ is there and provides this example. Everybody starts following Christ's example. And everybody starts doing this little by little, and little by little, the world gets gooder and gooder and better and better and better and better and better until there's no difference between earth and heaven. They're basically the same thing, and they start merging. And that's this idea of deification. So if you look at an Eastern church, Eastern Orthodox church, they got a whole bunch of symbols that reflect this idea of this merging of heaven and earth. So they have these domes that represent heaven coming down to earth, and they have a chandelier, and again, that's heaven coming down to earth. They have this iconoclast, this big screen, and the priest will do different things in front, and then they go behind it to do different rituals. And this is the idea they're going into heaven, then coming back down to earth. So this idea of this merging, and that's a key concept to understand what an icon is. Because an icon is actually a portal or a window. Since heaven and earth are so close and can be merged, it is seen as a window or portal between heaven and earth. And so when you're praying through this icon, you're actually praying on this window directly into heaven. And because it's heaven, it's shown that these people are otherworldly. So we showed symbols of otherworldliness where angels had wings and people had halos. And in Hindu art, they have multiple arms and such. Well, the way they're portraying otherworldliness is these certain distortions they give of the face and the shape. So there's very, very large eyes on an icon, because that's represents you're not only looking to you, but they're looking back to heaven as well, right? And an icon is set up in such a way that whether you're standing in front of it or off to one side or off to the other, the eyes seem like they're always looking directly at you. The mouth is very small because you're not supposed to speak to God, but to listen, and then the ears are correspondingly much larger, all right? And some other characteristics of this long, thin nose and a long neck. And you'll see something called reverse perspective. Okay, you can see it here. And it makes it like the head look distorted. Okay? So if you look at this, normally when you do perspective drawing, if something's close, it's big. If something's further away, it's small. So you're the painting's kind of set up like you're kind of standing here looking at this person. So the top of the head should actually be kind of smaller because it's further away. It almost kind of looks like the top of the head would be large if you're looking down at the individual, right? You'd see a big head on the smaller things. So the idea here is that it's trying to get this concept of heaven coming into earth and earth coming into heaven, that the perspective is coming both ways, right? There's this transmission, this communication kind of coming back and forth, right? Seeing things both ways. So that's why you see these distorted perspectives, where some things look larger that should be smaller, and some things are smaller that should be larger. And you can see the large ears and the small mouth and the large eyes and such here. Now, what's interesting about this is in the 50s and 60s, where they had what were called these UFO cults that got very, very popular. And people were looking for, aliens coming down to Earth. and our ancestors. You know, they're looking at the aliens built the pyramids and all this other kind of stuff. There are a lot of people spreading rumors that these pictures of the icons were actually pictures and proof that ancient aliens visited the earth, right? And that's why the icons look that way. But no, it's not the case at all. It's those different iconography reasons that I just gave you. So I could talk a real lot about icons because there's a ton of symbolism there, and you could kind of devote an entire class to that. But what to remember is they're not really adored as paintings or artwork. They're really adored as prayer objects to help you have this portal or window into heaven. Yeah, when you look at art, some people feel that some of the greatest art that's ever done from an artistic standpoint, and we're covering iconography rather than the artistic standpoint, is religious art. But the bad thing about looking at art from an aesthetic standpoint is there's always this disagreement. No matter how great an artwork is, somebody would still, criticize Michelangelo's David, and they'd say something like, well, what do you mean about these things? Put some pants on or something like this, right? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. And this kind of came up with the Mormons. If you go over to Salt Lake City and go over to the Mormons Visitor Center, you're going to see tons of different artwork done there. And even if you just go down to Palmyra and you look at the visitor center there, you're going to see tons of various artwork done there. And the Mormons are very big on this because when they came up with the Book of Mormon, they did not have the history of artwork that the Christians had to help the stories of the Book of Mormon. So very, very early on, even when Brigham Young was over there in Utah, they started sending people over to Paris, Mormons over to Paris and different centers of Europe and Italy to study painting. So they could come back and generate various types of artwork to illustrate different things in the Book of Mormon. What's interesting about a lot of the early artwork is that the background scenes are generally scenes around the Great Salt Lake, because they wanted to encourage pilgrims to come out there and settle, and they helped by viewing this artwork, they could see how beautiful it was at the Great Salt Lake, and they could increase their numbers and settle that area around the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Here's another picture, early painting that was done. And this is a scene, actually, not of the Sea of Galilee, but actually this is a scene in the Great Salt Lake. And they've continued these into modern times and into the 20th century. And one of the more famous Mormon artists in the 20th century was a fellow by the name of Arnold Freiberg. And there was a very famous movie producer that once saw one of Freiberg's paintings, illustration from the Book of Mormon. And that movie producer was Cecil B. DeMille. And he looked at this painting, he thought, this is great. He said, I'm thinking of doing a remake of the movie, The 10 Commandments, because there was an old version done that was a silent version. And he wanted to do the big 10 Commandments movie that we know with Charleston Heston and such. And he was just enthralled with the way this was pictured. And he didn't really have anything for the movie yet, right? He just had a concept he wanted to do the movie. So the first thing he did is he went back to Freiberg. I got to know who the artist is who did this. And he says, I want you to do me a series of paintings around the story of like the 10 Commandments. Remember the old silent film? Do me a whole series of paintings because I want to get a feel for this. So Freiberg generated a whole series of paintings for Cecil B. DeMille. And this is one of them. And Cecil B. DeMille used these paintings to create the movie. He used these paintings to lay out how all the scenic design was supposed to be done, how the sets were supposed to be laid out, how the costumes were supposed to be laid out, even who was supposed to be cast into the movie in terms of the look he was kind of looking for. It even influenced the scripts. And if you don't believe me, I'll show you some examples. Okay, here is one of the paintings that he gave Cecil B. DeMille at his early stage before he had anything, right? Here is an actual still from the movie. I mean, it's amazing how close they are, right? I'll go back to the painting that he originally did. You can see how he copied this to actually create the sets and costume of the actual movie. Here's another painting by Freiberg of Moses with the burning bush. And here is the scene from the movie with Charlton Heston standing in front of the burning bush. Again, you can see how closely he followed this in terms of the costume, the set design, the lighting, everything. Here's another one of Freiberg's paintings that he gave him. Okay, here's a scene from the movie. Charlton Heston and Yvonne DiCarlo down here. Again, painting. Here's the painting that he did of the Passover scene, first Passover. And here's the still from a movie. People have criticized a lot of the Mormon paintings. They've kind of derided them as gospel art, though I suppose it's ironic because the Ten Commandments is seen as the movie a work of art in terms of the cinematography and how they laid out the scenes. They're based off of Mormon paintings. But that's the great thing about looking at religious art from the perspective we've taken in the class, that we don't have to worry about artistic interpretation and aesthetics and all of that stuff. We can appreciate the art from its meaning. And even if you don't appreciate it as in terms of a work of art, you like it or dislike it, you can still appreciate the artwork in terms of the meaning that it gave the people who practiced those faiths and those religions and what they got out of it. So I want to thank you very, very much for attending my class, the 4 classes in understanding religious art. And maybe we can go back to Stacy and see if anybody has any questions.
So if anybody has any questions, just let me know. I can unmute you. Anybody?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay.
Yes, actually 2 of them. The first one, Jack, you had shown that the different statues of the Buddha, and I think in a past lecture you talked about Buddhist temples. I'm just wondering what function the Buddhist statues have in Buddhism. They seem to be every place, all different sizes. What's the difference between the people who come to worship at a Buddha statue as opposed to going to a Buddhist temple?
Yeah, a lot of the statues that people think are Buddhas are actually Bodhisattvas. A real popular one you'll see is this fellow with his big fat belly.
Yes.
Bodhisattvas are actually not the Buddha, they're actually kind of saints that help you achieve salvation. So a large number of the popular statues you see are Bodhisattvas, and a large number of the statues that people have in their homes and even in their temples are Bodhisattvas, okay? What's the role that they play in the temples? Pretty much the same role that the statues play in in a Hindu temple or in a Christian church. It just becomes a focal point to pray. And with the Bodhisattvas, the different Bodhisattvas would represent different types of things that you could get. I mean, there's the laughing Bodhisattvas, and there's the Bodhisattvas of generosity and Bodhisattvas of good health. So you may go to a particular Bodhisattva statue if you were looking for some kind of particular help on some particular dimension. Generally, for a Buddha statue itself, someone would pray to that generally for salvation, for nirvana, for release from that endless cycle of rebirth.
Very good. And also, real quickly, you mentioned in your lecture about how the West is basically centered in terms of Rome, but the Eastern Christianity group really has a number of different sites Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. Could you talk a little bit about the structure of the Eastern Christian Church?
Well, there is no central authority like a pope within the Eastern Church. There is one kind of person who's seen as a patriarch above patriarchs. And sometimes that title is given to the person of the Greek Orthodox Church, who kind of like coordinates things, but people don't report to them. So all of the different Eastern Orthodox churches, whether they're in Alexandria or the Coptic Church or the Syrian Church or the Armenian Church or the Ukrainian Church, they're all independent and can do their own thing, though they try to kind of coordinate between them in these different synods where they get together. Kind of almost like Protestantism, you know, where there isn't any central authority over people like the Methodist churches, for example, but they get together in these congregations and they decide kind of how they're going to coordinate things.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody's unmuted. If anybody has a question, just feel free to ask it.
We just want to say thank you, Jack, and thank you, Stacy. We've enjoyed these 4 presentations.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for
Very
coming.
good.
I have a quick question. I'm just curious, do you collect religious art? Is that how you came to be so knowledgeable?
No, it's more from the fact that I tend to teach a lot of classes in religious history.
Ah,
And it's through the knowledge of teaching the classes in religious history that I got involved with understanding a lot of the iconography and such involved with religious art. So a lot of times
Okay,
when I'm teaching a
interesting.
religious history class, they're a nice vehicle to teach some aspects.
Very knowledgeable. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. And thank you,
Thank you.
Jack, for an excellent presentation. We look forward to more in the future. Everybody stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Jack. It was great.
Bye.